Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Kartik. I am a research scientist here at MIT Quest for Intelligence, or MIT Siegel Family Quest for Intelligence. And I work on building out the BrainScore platform, which is a platform that allows users to assess how similar their models are to brain and behavioral data. Before I dive deep into BrainScore, I want to zoom out on a slide that Eric showed at the very beginning of today on what the Quest strategy essentially is. And the goal is to ultimately understand intelligence. And for decades, the natural sciences and engineering sciences have worked in parallel with each other. And what the Quest is trying to do is bring these two fields together to ultimately build integrated machine executable models of intelligence. And in this sort of system, the natural sciences perform experiments on biological subjects. They'll record behavioral data or take neural recordings. And these neural recordings and behavioral data will help to constrain the models that the engineering sciences produce. These models will then produce new hypotheses that can be further tested in the natural sciences. And as it was alluded to in the very beginning, this isn't a one-time step, but rather a virtuous cycle that continues to happen. But at the heart of this virtuous cycle, there is a fundamental challenge. We first need to identify when the models are in fact representative of the data that they're trying to model themselves. So historically, progress on this sort of domain has been made in piecewise efforts. Oftentimes, one lab will collect some data from some part of the brain. They will generate a model. This model will supposedly be highly aligned with this data. They'll publish it. They might store this data in some repo. They might keep it on a hard drive. But oftentimes, and maybe less so nowadays, oftentimes this used to be lost forever to time. And then comes along another lab. This lab will collect data from a different part of the brain. They too will generate their own sort of bespoke model, and they will also publish this. And this issue of data being lost it has been, I guess, less of an issue now with code availability and data availability statements in paper, but oftentimes there's a great deal of an issue in reusing the data due to limited standardization. And after decades of doing this, what you're left with is this zoo of data and this zoo of models that don't really talk with one another. The sum of all of these parts is much less than what they could be. And this is, part of the motivation for BrainScore. And the goal is that we ultimately build these integrated machine executable models of intelligence, labeled here system models of intelligence. They're not just aligned on one data set, but rather all data across all labs. And we believe that through this, we can build an accurate model of intelligence. So this is what BrainScore tries to achieve. BrainScore is an open, community-driven scientific resource. BrainScore transforms neuroscience knowledge into standardized, reproducible, machine-executable benchmarks that allow researchers to test models at scale. So on the natural sciences side, experimentalists will have some task. They will ask subjects to perform this task. The experimentalists will collect some behavioral data. They might also record neural data, either through fMRI, EEG, MEAs, or multi-electrode arrays. Then we at BrainScore help package this data, we standardize this data, and then we ask a model to perform the exact same, as much as we can at least, the same experiment that was performed in the lab. BrainScore will then record the internal states or the neural activity of the model and also the behavior, and then assess how similar the model is to the underlying data that it's trying to model. So to illustrate this, I have a very simple binary discrimination task. In Michael's presentation, he showed a slightly more complex version of this, but this is a task that exists currently on BrainScore. And this behavioral task, you'll see an image. That image contains an object of a category type. That image will disappear, and then you're presented with two options. And your job is to select the category that the first image belonged to. right? So hopefully you saw a dog or an animal and you've correctly selected the left-hand image. And what experimentalists will do is they'll run this type of experiment for hundreds of thousands of trials across hundreds of participants, and they can summarize the data in something that looks like a confusion matrix that you see here, where each cell represents how difficult it is to discriminate an object category of one type to that of another. We then at BrainScore work with the experimentalists to help package not only the data, but also the experimental paradigm, the stimuli, the block, the repetitions, the trial order, etc. And we package into something what we call a BrainScore benchmark that is a standardized format that's incredibly reproducible. We also have a somewhat simple to use API that basically tells the model to look at the images and perform the task. This model will then perform this experiment. We can collect the behavioral output of the model, and then we can ask how similar is the model's behavior to the human behavior. The same thing can be done for neural benchmarks, but instead of looking at the behavioral output, the actions that the humans took, we're taking a look at the neural recordings from a human participant. This participant performs some experiment. Similarly, the model looks at the stimuli. We have an additional step here where we record from a specific area in the model. The model performs the task. We can collect the internal states, format it in a way that makes it comparable, and then ask again, how similar is the model to the behavior, to the human or biological data? And importantly, we're not just doing this for one benchmark, but rather we're doing this across all the benchmarks that currently exist on BrainScore. We can summarize this into a nice heat map. This is kind of dense and barely visible on this slideshow, but the data that you're seeing here is also the data that's available currently on brainscore.org. So if you're really interested, you can go. We have a leaderboard that shows all of the models. So the models are on the sort of x-axis, all the benchmarks that we currently have on the y, and you can see how well models perform across all of the benchmarks that we have. So that's it for at least the slideshow presentation. I'm going to move on to a little notebook showing sort of a hands-on demo of how you can install and run BrainScore. I am going to, so I probably should have mentioned this at the very beginning of my slide, but there was a URL at the bottom right corner of the presentation that contains the repo that you can use to follow along. I don't think anybody's going to follow along right now, but I'm just going to showcase the workflow on the notebook anyway. Let's see. Cool. So when you download that notebook, so it takes you to a little repo like this. If you are using a Windows computer or you don't have a development environment, you can run this on Google Colab. I've built the notebook so that the instructions are pretty clear. So if you're ever curious about what I'm about to show you and you go home and you want to sort of play around with this, you can go to this repo and just press open in Colab, and it'll take you to something like this, and it'll tell you how to do everything. But for now, I'm going to probably stick with my IDE of choice. So to get started, the first thing that, so I guess I'll talk about what BrainScore is again. But fundamental to BrainScore, there are two parts. There's obviously the models, which is basically any computational system that can sort of take in input as some stimuli as input and can produce some behavioral output. Ideally, these models are accessible to us in a way that they can produce these internal representations. Typically, these are activations at a per layer level. These models typically are, from BrainScore, are PyTorch, deep artificial neural networks, or artificial deep neural networks. On the other hand, what's as important, perhaps maybe even more important, are the actual benchmarks themselves. And as I said in my slideshow, a benchmark attempts to reproduce an experiment. And it does so by combining data. I'm going to maybe zoom in a little bit more. Data, which is either the behavioral behavior of the human or the neural recordings themselves. It also combines stimuli, which is the task design, the images that were shown to the participant, and any other metadata that might be important for this experiment. We also have a metric, which defines how we're going to actually compare the model's output to the behavior of the humans. And we also have something called a ceiling, which basically accounts or normalizes the score that you will get to account for any noise that might be present. So once again, the pipeline is you show images to a model. That model will produce either behavioral output or produce some activations from its internal layers, and then we'll just make that comparison. What you will ultimately receive is a score between 0 and 1. If that score is 0, that means that that model did not perform well at all compared to the biological data. If a score produces 1, that model is a perfect match, at least relative to the biological data that it was tested against. For neural benchmarks, most scores are between 0.3, 0.5. On behavior side, they tend to trend a little bit higher. Some really easy to follow, installation commands. I already have this installed, so I'm going to maybe skip over it. A couple extra steps where if you run this, it'll verify the installation. What we're using is BrainScore Vision, which is a version of BrainScore that largely focuses on the visual domain. We also have a BrainScore language, and sort of as we progress into the future, we hope to no longer have these sort of siloed off domains, but rather a singular BrainScore that can handle all types of models. Recently, BrainScore underwent a refactor that changed the architecture of BrainScore into what we call a plugin-based system. And what this ultimately means is that if you go to the Vision directory, you'll see that there are a number of folders, but the 4 main folders that are going to be of interest to you are models, benchmarks, data, and metric. And these folders are basically contain themselves individual plugins. So say if you were really interested in a model called Kartik's model, you would produce a plugin that you would then completely host in the models folder. And the benefit to using this is that say if you're really interested in contributing data or contributing a model or benchmarks, you only have to work out of that one plugin folder without having to modify or touch any other aspects of BrainScore. So in a way, BrainScore Vision is quite modular right now. So finally getting our hands dirty, I think the first thing I want to show you was, okay, what do these actual benchmarks look like? What does the data look like? So for this sort of workshop / tutorial, I'm going to largely focus on a neural data set, but we have a number of other data sets that are both behavior and neural that you can also investigate. The specific data or benchmark that I'm going to be showcasing is one called Majaj-Hong, which is a neural data set that contains multi-electrode array recordings, so electrodes that were stuck to the visual cortex of the brain, specifically 2 parts of the visual cortex. And subjects that underwent this experiment, what they did is that they viewed 3,200 unique images with variations in size, position, and rotation. In order to load this data set, all we have to do is run BrainScore Vision.load dataset, and then what we call the identifier for this plugin. So every plugin folder has an identifier, and if you're interested in a different data set, you can find the identifier quite simply by just going to the data folder. Say if you're interested in the Baker data set, you can just go to the init and copy this little identifier right there, and paste it there instead, and run it and download that data set. So we could run it. For the first time, you'll see that it downloads from our S3 bucket. This takes probably just a few seconds, depending on how large this data set is. Now, this neural data set contains quite a bit of metadata. You can, if you're really interested in what this metadata looks like, you can uncomment this field and see everything. I'm not going to do that because it's quite overwhelming. In this data set, we see that there was 148,000 stimulus presentations from 256 neurons. and only a singular time bin. So if you recall, I said something about 3,200 unique images were shown. This was shown to 2 participants, and there were a number of repetitions that ultimately resulted in 148,000. We can see the other metadata that's also included here. A lot of it's related to the image transformations that were done to produce the stimuli, but you can see here that there's also information on like the region that neurons were from, the time bins, and et cetera. So this specific data set contains data from 2 regions, the IT and the V4 regions of the visual cortex, and the object categories that the stimuli cover are these 8 categories. If we want to visualize what this stimulus or one such stimulus looks like, you can easily do that here. Some of this code, basically, we are loading the stimulus set, and we're just printing out the first stimulus that we come across. We can also print out all the different categories, and this is sort of an example of what the images look like. So now that we have some idea of what the human participant saw or the biological subject saw, as well as what now the model will be seeing, we can also see what the neural responses look like. In this sort of piece of code, what we're doing is simply filtering the data so that we're looking at only neural responses from the IT region. And then because I said that the neural data had a number of repetitions, we're just gonna plot the average neural activity for that was found in the brain for each of the images. We can do that just by running average repetition here. This takes a few seconds because it's quite a large data set. And once we do that, we see that we went from, I think, 256 neurons that were originally part of this data set, and of that, only 168 are from the IT cortex in the brain. So now, what you're about to see next is one way to represent the data. This is a way of representing the data that we've used in the past and the original paper also used, but essentially what it's going to produce is a barcode pattern for each image. Now, because this data is taken from the brain and the brain is 3-dimensional, you could theoretically map this into a 3-dimensional space, but for simplicity, I've produced or reproduced some of these barcode images. So in this case, every line that you see here is one neuron from the neural data set. And wherever it's black means that that neuron was not active at all during the presentation of this image. And where it's brighter green means that this neuron was firing or considerably more active relative to baseline. And we can see here that every image category has a slightly different pattern of firing. Right? So this is ultimately what we will be comparing our model's activations to. So now that we have a good idea of what the benchmark is, what the data looks like, what the stimulus images look like, and now what the neural data looks like, if we were really interested in scoring a specific model on this benchmark, all we have to do is run one line of code after obviously importing our library and importing the function. In this case, we have a function called score. It has 2 parameters, model identifier and benchmark identifier. For the purpose of this sort of demo, I'm using AlexNet. AlexNet is sort of not state of the art, but was the standard for quite some time. Came back in sort of really, I think, pushed the field of computer vision in a totally different direction. I think what made it popular was that it really leveraged GPUs more than past models. But if you are interested in other models, you can just replace the AlexNet identifier with another identifier found in here. So in the models folder, we have hundreds of other models. Most of these are submitted by users of BrainScore. So say if I was really interested in a model called Inception V1, if I can find it. Or maybe not Inception, but like say EvResNet. All I have to do is go to the init file, copy the identifier, and replace AlexNet with that. And in a very simple way, you can now assess a whole library of models with a single change, a single parameter being changed. Similarly, if you were interested in a different benchmark, not a neural benchmark, but say a behavioral benchmark, you can just replace the identifier here and return it. So I would love to run this, but this takes 1 minute 50 seconds, and I don't want to currently do that and then have some silence. So I've run this ahead of time, and what we outputted was a neural productivity score of 0.412. And what ultimately happened here was that we loaded AlexNet, we showed it the same 3,200 images, we extracted the internal states of this model at a specific layer, we did some regression, and then we got a score, and we normalized that score to the ceiling. And if we were really interested in what the raw score was for AlexNet on this benchmark, it was 0.58. The ceiling, meaning sort of the reliability of this data by itself, how much can the human data predict human data, it was 0.816. And when we sort of try to produce what we call a sealed score, we see that AlexNet predicts 41.2% of the explained variance in the IT cortex. So that's at a very brief glance how you can run scoring on your own, not just on AlexNet on a bunch of benchmarks, but you can sort of do any model and any benchmark. You can even sort of create your own models. If you have the data, you can package your own data and also evaluate models that way. And like I said in the slideshow, we're not just doing this for one benchmark, but we're doing this across over 100 benchmarks, some biological, some neural, some behavioral, and even some engineering. And whenever a user, such as yourself or us, submit a model, we have this long pipeline that tests the models, performs a mapping procedure so that the layers of the model map to the specific parts of the brain, and they're finally evaluated across all of our benchmarks. And all of this data can be viewed on our website. So you can click there, brainscore.org/vision/leaderboard. It's taking a second to load. There we go. All right, and the way that the leaderboard is currently organized is that we have a global score that is an average of neural and vision. Let me just do that. Average of vision. If you're specifically interested in one part of the brain, you can expand neural to see, how does a model perform on the IT cortex? Or if you don't care at all about neural and you're purely interested in behavior, what you can do is you can just drop out the neural vision and you can see how models perform on just behavior. And what you'll find is that a lot of models that might be ranked really high based on the average of neural and vision all of a sudden sort of drop down. And this is, I think, most stark when we look at models that perform really well on neural benchmarks, where the top 10 models are hardly seen in when we just factor in the neural vision benchmarks. And this is partially because a lot of people care more about models being able to predict neural activity. So that is the website. We also have recently overhauled some of the tutorials that are present. So if you're interested in submitting models, you can go to the models section. If you're interested in submitting a benchmark or really curious, when you run that score command, what's actually happening under the hood, you can go to one of the tutorials. Neural benchmark describes how, when you run scoring, what is actually happening. And yeah, so that is that. So I still have some time, so I can, yeah. Okay, so I'm going to keep it maybe hopefully a little bit brief, talk a little bit about what the actual brain model interface is, and maybe describe how flexible BrainScore is. The vast majority of models in BrainScore are PyTorch-based, deep sort of artificial neural networks. But BrainScore was built to be framework agnostic. And so long as your custom model, say a JAX model, complies with the framework that BrainScore describes, BrainScore can work with that model. So the main functions that you want to reproduce are the look-at function, which describes how the model behaves when it looks at the stimuli. Start recording, basically, how do we get the activations and what it does when we run the task. We can also use these functions to sort of run BrainScore just to see how just to see what a model's layer outputs could be to a custom image that's not part of a benchmark. So here, what I've done is I've loaded AlexNet. I'm telling that I'm going to record from the IT region of this model, and then I'm going to tell the model to look at a bunch of images and then sort of print out the output. So if you see here, we see that model prediction shape 10. This layer of AlexNet had 9,200 neurons in this, and if we want to visualize it, you can see it in the very similar manner. And these are the model's outputs formatted in a very similar way to the way that I presented the biological data. Obviously, one thing you might notice is that there are many more neurons in the model than there are in the actual data, and the metric that you choose has to factor this into account for that. But say if you were really interested, you had an image and you wanted to predict, okay, what would the model's layers activations look like? And if we could reverse and predict what this would look like in the brain, the way that you can do this is by loading a custom image. I'm using a picture of my cat. We build what we call a stimulus set, which is the data standard that we use, or the data format that we use to package the stimulus image. Once again, we load the model. We record from the IT region, and we tell the model to look at this image. And when we do that, it does some work in the background, and we can plot it. And this is an image of my cat and AlexNet's response at the IT layer of this. And with some work, you can also work backwards to map the model's activations to actual brain neuron responses. So that's more or less what I wanted to cover. We covered what is BrainScore, some very high-level installation. We downloaded a neural data set, explored what the stimulus looked like, what the neural data looked like. We scored a model. We visited the BrainScore website, and we showed how you can, use BrainScore to investigate how model outputs look like to custom images. If you're interested in learning more, brainscore.org is your site. As I said before, this is an open source project, largely community driven, so please check out our GitHub repository for not just BrainScore Vision, but also language, which we're now pushing the front again. And for more tutorials, you can just visit the tutorials tab on brainscore.org. With that said, thank you so much. Correct me if I'm wrong here, but you made a statement that this is sort of one approach to evaluating a model to a benchmark. And how do we know that this is the right solution versus some other approach?
Right. Or somehow, yes.
Okay. That is certainly fair. A lot of the benchmarks, if not all of the benchmarks that we use, are actual neuroscience experiments done in the lab. And because they're done in the lab, there's a little bit of trust in terms of that the science is found, but because they're done in a lab, they assess fundamental aspects of compute or cognition and intelligence that are really important to us, at least at BrainScore. One of the things that I didn't really talk about now, but especially with the popularity of LLMs, there are a lot of these leaderboards out there that try to evaluate models based on some, task. Oftentimes it's like coding, sometimes it's some arbitrary IQ test. But I think what makes BrainScore unique and why I think we offer something different that still has a lot of value is that we are grounded in scientific experiments. A lot of the benchmarks that we look at are psychophysical, right? They assess the fundamental units of intelligence, not a lot. We currently do not support a lot of the cognitive science benchmarks. That is something that we are exploring. So in a way, right now we assess one dimension of intelligence, but we are interested in broadening that.
Just to expand on that answer a little bit. One thing to keep in mind is that you have to consider the problem that we're attempting to solve. What we care most deeply about is how similar a given model is to what we know of the way the human brain works, whether that's from a behavioral output or whether that's from recordings of the individual neurons. We don't care, for instance, about which model is best at recognizing categories for 1,000 images. That is a different metric. That is an equally valid metric in certain settings. It's just not something we are looking to investigate. And so you have to keep in mind what each platform is trying to test. At its root, we want to understand how the human brain works and gives rise to intelligence. And so our platform is going to be biased in that direction. That makes sense?
Thank you, yeah. But anyway, this is a good start.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Any other questions?